There's exactly 1 month to go today, and Labor has spent much of the year just in a polling death spiral. They're currently about half of what they were when they won the election in 2020, and National has just slowly been creeping up. You think just 2 years ago, Labor was actually starting to increase its majority. National rolled its leader because they were so concerned at how badly they were polling, and this new leader, Chris Luxon, has just been steadily improving the party's performance in the polls. Now, of course, there is still a month to go, so there's still plenty of time for Labor to pull, an incredible policy out of the hat that convinces voters. And, there's still plenty of time for National to do something stupid that, makes voters believe that Labor, they'll stick with them.
Yeah. Of course, the Jacinda Ardern factor was a very big one, and she made that decision to step away from politics. Has that played into Labor's collapse?
Sort of. So under her performance, they were sliding, and then she stepped aside at the beginning of this year. Chris Hipkins took the premiership pretty much unopposed, and it did lead to an immediate bump in the polls. People liked what they saw. He was good at responding to a crisis. Pretty much immediately, he was having to deal with severe flooding in Auckland and Cyclone Gabrielle, which took out a lot of the east coast of the North Island. And so people liked what they saw. They liked that he was a good man in a crisis, but he has been beset this year by problems of the party's own making, a series of ministerial scandals. You had one minister have to resign for declaring confidential cabinet information to his donors. You had a minister defect to another party. You had another minister who failed to declare his conflicts of interest, and it all culminated when the justice minister got arrested for disorderly driving. And so people have just sort of, even though Chris Hipkins has been able to handle crises like the cost of living crisis, perhaps, or climate change, he hasn't been able to handle those crises in his own backyard.
Yeah. But let's talk a little bit about the cost of living crisis, and that is a big issue for New Zealanders.
Yeah, it has been. I mean, like the most recent books showed that we have actually passed the peak of inflation. We're sitting at about 6% now, but it's still going to be not until about December next year that it finally gets to that magic 3% band. And, it's incredibly unfortunate for Labor that an election is happening right in the middle of all of this, where National can come in and say, oh, we're going to be the better economic managers. Now, Labor has tried to do a few policies to address the cost of living. They want to take GST off fresh fruit and veg, or they want to give free dental to people under 30. But National's coming in with this big golden tax cut promise where they're going to adjust those tax brackets for inflation. Now, there's a lot of talk of that they don't really know how they're going to pay for these, because a central tenet of this is they want to reopen the housing market to foreign buyers while taxing them on properties over $2 million. But it doesn't really seem like that's actually going to bring in enough money that they think. But the reality is that Labor and all these economists can say, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? Ultimately, if the public wants tax cuts, that's what they're going to vote for.
Yeah, and that seems to be the biggest issue that is driving the surge as well for the Nationals, doesn't it? Has their leader, do they have a charismatic leader? Is he making an impact in terms of people being drawn to him?
Well, it's worth noting that this time 3 years ago, he wasn't even an MP. His rise has been, pretty swift. He, former Air New Zealand CEO, so people, have liked what they've seen of him as a businessman. But for ages, even though National was starting to overtake Labor in the polls, his preferred prime minister rating, Chris Luxon's preferred prime minister rating, was still lower than Chris Hipkins. Now, in the most recent polls in the last week or so, they are neck and neck. And a lot of that is because he has been campaigning like he is already prime minister. I was out with him on Sunday, and what should have been walking just down one block, it took about 40 minutes because you stopped and shook hands and took pictures of every single other person. Whereas Chris Hipkins, he's kind of a bit weak on this. He's not a big fan of small talk. He just sort of says, hi, how you going, and moves on. And the public want to see him get a little bit more engaged. Where he does excel is debating, and the two of them have their first debate next Tuesday, and that'll be a real opportunity for the public and for Chris Hipkins to sort of be back on more solid ground, because that is where he probably has one up over Chris Luxon, is in that debating chamber.
Yes, and the experience, of course, of being in government. Is there a scenario where Labor could still form a coalition government with the current polling as it is?
Not at the moment. The current polls have them with their traditional coalition partner, the Greens, and also Te Pāti Māori together, I think the most recent poll had them on 51 seats together, and they need 60 to get over the line. So not at the moment. The risk is that the Greens are starting to poll really, really well, but all that's really doing is eating into Labour's vote. The left bloc isn't doing enough at the moment to bring people back from the right bloc to consider that. There's all these talks around coalitions of chaos and things like that. But at the moment, the right bloc is really starting to solidify its grip.
Yeah. New Zealand First, of course, had been a kingmaker in past elections, but they went out at the last election. Could they gain representation again, do you think?
In the most recent polls, it's looking likely. They need to hit 5% to get over that line. And some of the polls have them just, bouncing either side of that 5% mark. Like Winston Peters is a survivor. He's managed to convince a whole bunch of people who would never have considered voting for him to vote for them this time, mostly because he's hitched his wagon onto sort of freedom movements and things like that. He wants investigations into vaccine injuries. He's coming out with these sort of anti-transgender policies that, some parts of society are deciding that they want to hitch their wagon to him. He's already ruled out working with Labour again, and Labour then went, OK, well, we're rolling out working with you, so it doesn't matter. The difficulty for him is that the ACT Party, which is one of the other parties in the right bloc, they don't want to work with Winston Peters. The two leaders of those two parties can't stand each other, whereas Christopher Luxon, basically, he doesn't really want to talk about it. He doesn't really want to talk about whether he would work with Winston Peters because he's not in Parliament at the moment. But as we get closer to election day, he might start to have to come up with a more definitive answer on that.